Hello everybody. By popular demand, I've got one more tutorial for you now. We're going to be looking at systems that allow you to spawn in enemies. So this can either be used as a system just to spawn enemies in at a set point, or what most people are going to use it for is a wave-based system for having multiple waves of enemies. Just to highlight what I've currently got on the scene, I've got an enemy which is called Zombie 1. This has a NavMesh agent and an enemy motion script that moves towards the target. Go watch my tutorial about intro to AI navigation, basics of path planning, if you haven't already watched that, about how to get enemies to move around if that's important for your game. I've also got a game controller which is currently just handling my NavMesh agent as well as my timer script. If you haven't seen my timer tutorial and would like to do timers, I've got a two-parter on how to do timers. But what we're primarily interested in here now is advancing our game controller, so it's going to say I would like to spawn more of these with their behaviours at set intervals. So just to highlight what the game currently does, I've got Zombie 1, it walks, and if I go into the zombie folder into its prefabs, I can see that if I make many more Zombie 1s, it creates more of them with those properties, but notice how they are no longer moving towards the player. Notice how the target for enemy motion is set to none, because it can't find my player anymore. That's going to be important, so I just want to highlight how to solve that problem should you ever need to spawn in objects that need to reference something currently in the scene. The most common instance this is going to happen is if it's looking for your game controller, or if it's looking for your target, which is often your player if that's what it's trying to move towards. So if I look at my zombie script and the enemy motion attached to that script, very simple script. We're using UnityEngine.ai. I've got a public transform for the target we're trying to move towards, and every frame move towards that target. What I'm going to do here is just modify this script, and you might want to do the same for any of your scripts that use things that spawn in. So I'm going to add in a start method here, and what I'm going to do is set target to equal something that I'm going to get. So I'm going to call the game object, and from that I can use find game object. Notice singular, I want to find the object, not the objects. I want to find an object with a tag. Go find the thing with the tag of player. That will get the game object dot transform will return information about its transform. So that's all valid code. Notice the semicolon at the end as well. And even if my target is not set now for whatever reason, so if I set target to none, and I'll just queue this up so I can easily drag more in, what we should see is when it's first spawned in, it goes and finds the target based on its tag. But we can see our first failed test here. The variable target for enemy motion has not been assigned. So what happened is my enemy tried to find something with the tag of player and it failed to find it. If I look at my XR origin, we can hopefully see the problem over here under the tag. The XR origin doesn't have the tag of player, so it couldn't be found. If I choose from the drop down, there's a pre-made tag called player with a capital P. Let's see if that resolves the problem. We can now see that enemy is moving towards the player, and any further zombies that I spawn in will have those default properties. Just remember that because I'm spawning in prefabs, whatever the prefab settings are whatever the object will have when the game starts. Notice the speed property for this prefab is 3.5, but if I click on the zombie in my game, I'd customized it to be a speed of 1, which I prefer. If I want to change this zombie to have those properties, I can either go into the zombie prefab itself and change it there, or I can select the object that I'm happy with in my game and override it so its properties apply to all types of that object now. So if I drag a new one in, it should have a speed of 1. So you can see there that using prefabs lets us override things, and now they both move at a speed of 1. So far so good. I'm going to delete both of those out of my scene because our game controller is now going to do the hard work. So spawn points. I'm going to use our game controller to do both things. settings? No. I'm going to make a new object to manage this directly in case anyone gets confused. So I'm going to create a new empty game object, which I'm going to call spawn. That'll do. And because I think this is quite important, I'm just going to put some dashes on either end. For those of you wondering why I've got dashes here, it's just because for things that are important, I like to make them stand out in the hierarchy. Doesn't mean anything, it's just easy to find. Our spawn point is going, or our spawn object is going to contain a spawn script. And I'm also going to create a series of children inside of this object, which I'm going to call point 1, and then point 2, point 3, point 4. But it's really difficult to see where that spawn point is. Currently you can see it's in the middle of nowhere. I'm going to move this to 0, 0, 0, so it's the point of origin, but that still doesn't really help. I still can't see the spawn point. Because this is an invisible object, I'm going to go next to its name and choose an icon, just so that I can see wherever this spawn point is, it now has an icon, so I can easily move it around. So in my game, I'm going to be able to choose 3 spawn points, and I'm going to always have the same zombie spawned in. You could add this a little bit more complicated, so you could have it spawn in multiple zombies or multiple different enemy types. But for now, a spawn object has multiple spawn points, so I'm just going to duplicate that with a Control D, Control D. So I've got point 1, I'm going to rename this to point 2. And then rather unsurprisingly, I'm going to have point 3. So what we've now got with our spawn object is its job is to choose either point 1 or point 2 or point 3, which I've just positioned anyway. It doesn't matter where the spawn object is, it just matters where the points are. Its script is going to pick one of those 3 points and instantiate a zombie there. So let's add a script to our spawn object. Notice I'm not in any of the spawn points, just the spawn object, which is the parent. I'm going to call this spawn as well. Just like our timer script, we're going to have something that counts down over time. So that's what we're going to add in our start under our class. A public float called the time, which starts life at 0. Going to have a public float for spawn time, which starts life at, let's say, 10, but that's the default. You can always override it. I'm going to delete my start function because I only care about the update loop. What we're going to do to the time is it will go up plus equals time dot delta time, semicolon, say that we're done. So every frame the time will increase 1 second per second, and then if, how good is the autocomplete? Oh, it's not bad. If the time is greater than or equal to the spawn time, if that's the case, we are going to spawn in our game object. To do this, we need a reference to the game object we wish to spawn in. So underneath our reference to the time and the spawn time, I'm going to create a public game object, which is going to be called spawn object. Oh, this autocomplete is not bad at all, is it? Did most of that work for me. So what we've got now is a reference to our spawned object, which is going to be our zombie, but it could be any object at all. Once that time is greater than the spawn time, I'm going to instantiate, that is our key word here. We're going to instantiate spawn object. That's totally valid code and would work, but there's 2 things we need to do here to fix this. The first thing is that without changing the time back to 0, every frame after this, well, the time will be greater than the spawn time, and it will just keep spawning in, spawning in, spawning in, and eventually you'll crash your computer. The second thing is it doesn't know where to spawn this object in. It knows what to spawn, but it doesn't know where to spawn. So we're going to come back to that in a second, but our first solution is for our if statement, we're going to set the time back to 0. And that happens if the time's greater than the spawn time, resets back to 0, and then starts counting back up again, gets to 10, spawns our object in, back to 0, and that will carry on forever. If we wanted to do something more complicated here with waves, we could have the spawn time increase or decrease over time. But we're going to start basic and then ramp up complexity for those who might want it. So our second thing is we need to know where we're going to instantiate our object. Now we've got 3 spawn points, and we can absolutely use 3 spawn points. I can make a reference up here to 3 spawn points. I can make a public transform, which I'm going to call point 1. I could now have one for point 2, could have one for point 3. That's fine, but that's not very scalable. What is better is if I have a transform called points, but instead of this being a single object that it's got a reference to, I'm going to make it a transform array by using an open and close square bracket. What that now means is I've got an array of spawn points I can use. If I save that, I'll show you what that looks like in game. My spawn script now has the time, the spawn time, the object we wish to spawn, and this weird little thing with the drop down for points. Keep in mind, in this context, points means spawn points of where I want to create it. I can add lots of spawn points. I can put little icons there to say how many I want. Or what I can instead do is just drag and drop point 1 onto the word points. You think you go there, but it doesn't. It goes over the word points. And I'm going to do the same for point 2. And I'm going to do the same for point 3. This has now created an array of 3 points you could possibly choose to spawn in. So, what we can do here with instantiate is, this is the thing I wish to spawn, comma, this is where I wish to spawn it. Now, to do this, I'm going to pick a random number. So I may as well, just above instantiate, create a random number. And I'm going to call this something like temp, which is going to equal random.range. And it's going to be a range of numbers that it's going to generate between 0 and whatever the length of the points array is. Because you may have more points than 3. This will support as many as you've got spawn points. Points.length. So now, whatever is stored in this temp variable is whatever random point we chose, and it will be a value between 0 and however long it is. Remember, arrays start counting at 0, so if I've got my 3 items, it will generate either the number 0, 1, or 2 for my 3 items. I'm holding my fingers up right now, you can't see them, but 0, 1, and 2 for my 3 possible locations. So what I now wish to do is I want to spawn object, comma, I want to spawn that in at the spawn points, open and close brackets, temp. So that will be whatever it's chosen from that list, dot position, comma, points, dot points, I've forgotten how to code, temp, dot rotation, and that should do it. So what that will now do is pick one of those things at random and spawn the zombie in there. Assuming, of course, I've told it which object to spawn, which in my case is in the zombie folder, in the prefabs folder, and it's zombie 1 I wish to spawn. So I'm going to drag that into the object spawn. You may find it's quite difficult to move around and choose the item that you want, so you may find it more useful to click on the little circle next to it, and you can choose either from the assets folder or an object currently within the scene, and I strongly recommend you choose from the assets, which is this space down here, because if you accidentally delete the object in your scene and you're trying to spawn it, or you defeat it or something like that, the script will fail. Let's see what this now does. I'm just going to watch this from the scene view. Every 10 seconds, let's reduce that down for testing. Every 5 seconds, it should pick one of these points at random. So it could pick the same one again, because remember, that's how random works. And now it's picking those locations and it's moving towards us. Let's pick that one again. And I lost the game because I ran out of time. So what we can see here is that picked a series of random objects, and I did a bit of stress testing. It demonstrated it could pick the first element in the array, which is element 0, and it could pick the final element of the array, which is element 2. I have confidence it would pick that middle one as well if given enough time, but I would absolutely test it in your game. This supports multiple spawn points. So if you decided you now wanted an extra couple of spawn points dotted around your map, you don't need to change any of your code at all. I may want to rename this, but it doesn't matter. All I would now need to do is to make sure those 2 points are now included in my list. There we go. And hopefully we should see it picking any of those points. Oh, I should probably reset that back to 5 for testing. It chose that one in this instance. Let's just set it to 1 and see what happens. So now that with a delay of 1, with 1 second between each spawn, ease of testing, and you could see it was generating from a variety of them. What you may want to do is, rather than it having it spawn one thing in and then reset, maybe you wish to spawn a wave of enemies in. So let's say it will pick a bunch of them and spawn them in. That's a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to show you a solution you may wish to use. What I'm going to do here is, inside of the if statement, create a for loop. Now what a for loop looks like is for int I semicolon, or int I equals 0 semicolon. I is less than whatever value it is you wish to create. So let's say we want to make 10 of our zombies. Semicolon I++. I'll go through that in more detail later on, but just for now, accept that if I put a squiggly bracket after the for loop and at the bottom of that block, it will now create 10 zombies for the price of 1, but it will pick a random number each time. So I hope it won't generate all the zombies at the same spawn point, but it should randomly spread them around the spawn points, and I expect 10 once our 10-second counter has counted down. Let's see what that does. There we go. I've got a bunch of them spawning in at random points, and let's just set this down to 2 again, so every 2 seconds they're spawning in, and because of the navmesh agent, they're spacing them apart. So just to quickly go through what that for loop is doing is it's creating a temporary variable which we're calling I and setting it to 0. While I is less than whatever value you wanted, in this case 10, do a loop, go through this block of code, and then when it reaches the end of the code, do whatever this thing is, this condition, which means add 1 to I. So it starts life at 0, does the code, adds 1 to it. Is that less than 10? Yes, it is. Repeats, add 1 to it. Is that less than 10? And then repeats 10 times. There is one more thing I would like to do to improve this code, which is to make a public int called spawn amount, which I'm going to set to 10. So now, rather than spawning in 10 times, it will spawn in whatever the spawn amount is. All that means is that it's now editable in the inspector. So I've now got a value for how many we wish to spawn. Just for my own amusement, I'm going to set the spawn time to 5, and I'm going to set the spawn amount to something like 50. Always pays to stress test. There we go, and we've got 50 enemies being spawned in. Obviously that's a completely acceptable place to leave your program. If you're still sitting around and you'd like to learn a little bit more, let's look at what we can do with this to make it even more interesting. I'm getting this restore up appear everywhere on my screen. Maybe you guys can see it in the recording, maybe you can't, but it's starting to get in the way. So one thing I'm interested in now is having a count of how many waves we have played, and also making it so we can only spawn in new enemies once we've defeated all of them. So what I would like to do first is just keep a log of public int wave count, wave number. Starts life at 0 because we haven't spawned in a wave yet. Whenever the time is greater than the spawn time, I would like the wave number to go up by 1. Notice that that is outside of the for loop, otherwise that would go up by 1 each time we went through the loop, which we don't want, we just want it to go up by 1. Now, all that is doing is making the number go up. So again, we can test this. I'm just going to reduce the spawn time down. We can test this by just seeing the wave number go up. In this case now, every 3 seconds. You can see we've got wave number 1, wave number 2, wave number 3. You get the idea. But because this is a variable inside of the script, we can do something with it. We can use it in some interesting ways. So let's just imagine that your game is supposed to get harder. Well, why not make it so the amount that spawn in is equal to the spawn amount times by the wave number? Let's see what that does. So now I could start with a very, very small spawn amount. Maybe we should only spawn in 2 zombies. Oh, notice what happens the first wave though. So we get to spawned in 2 zombies. Then I spawned in 4 zombies. Then I spawned in 8 zombies. Because each time it's taking that 2 and times in bit by whatever the wave number is. So if this game were to take longer to play out, I've got a natural difficulty curve now baked into my game, just because I'm saying whatever the wave number is. Maybe you don't like that, or maybe that's not something that you want. But what I'm now interested in doing is just one final thing. Public bool start spawn. What I'm interested in now is only spawning things in if I've defeated all the ones currently on the map. This may be a little bit more complicated and I may abandon this because it's quite late and my brain is not working, but let's do this anyway. In the if statement, I would only like to spawn things in if the time is greater than or equal to the spawn time, and that's just 2 ampersands, that's shift and 7 on your keyboard twice. We are able to start spawning. What I'm now going to do is set start spawn just here to false. So now, because those 2 statements have to be true, start spawn has to be true, and our timer has to have counted up, and then I'm setting it to false once we've created that wave. Even though the counter has gone above our spawn count, it shouldn't spawn any more in after that first wave. So again, we're waiting 3 seconds, we spawn things in, we're no longer able to start spawning, it's going to go above 3, we get no more zombies being spawned in. Now what we need to do is to keep a log of how many zombies are in the game. Public int enemies in game. Could call it enemies in wave, whatever works for you. There are 0 in the game. But every time we spawn something in, as well as the time going down to 0 and the temp generating a random number and us spawning them in at that point, we're also going to make the enemies in game go up by 1. Okay. So notice now the enemies in game should increase for each enemy spawned in. It's gone to 2 because there's 2 enemies. I'm just going to hard code that to true. There are 6 enemies in game, which there are. Because this is only a quick demo scene, I'm going to try something. Okay, so I'm going to cheat a little bit here because your game is going to be different to what mine is doing at this point. You may have many different ways of defeating your enemy. You may have a when its health reaches 0, it's despawned. You could have it play a death animation. You could have it turn its collider off. Some of you have got it ragdolling. But whatever the thing in your game that defeats your enemy is, we're going to need to call the spawn script and say, oi spawn script, something has happened. So what I'm going to do here is just write that function. That's going to be a public void remove enemy. And every time we remove an enemy, the number of enemies in the game is going to go down by 1. So I've got this function called remove enemy. And I'll show you what that looks like in a script if we get the opportunity for it. But basically, in this spawn script, I want the ability to remove our enemies from our game. Because this is a demo, I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to say when an enemy is removed from the game, and I'm just going to remove it from the inspector, we are going to call the remove enemy function. Let's do some more coding before I test this because I'm feeling brave. So in our remove enemy function, we're going to take our enemies down by 1. If the enemies in game is less than or equal to 0, well, that means we've defeated all the enemies. And you know what? Our start spawn should go back to being true. Let's see what that does. So if I were writing a testing table right now, like you all should be doing, what I would be testing here is, does my start spawn turn off when I've created my first wave? Good. I've got the accurate count of enemies within the game. And if I destroy one of these zombies, does it know that I've lost one? Deleting it doesn't destroy it. Okay. Okay. That's going to make it a little bit more challenging for me to test. I've got confidence that this will work, but I just can't bother to write an entire shoot script when you've seen me write it a dozen times by now. Oh, let's cheat a little minute. I'm going to tell zombies in my game. This is really inefficient. Don't copy this bit out, for God's sake. I'm just going to tell enemies in my game to disappear after a second. That should do it. Talk amongst yourselves. Again, this is just representing what you would have in your shoot scripts. You can try and figure out where I'm going, but ultimately what should now happen is those enemies should despawn after a second, and we should become able to spawn in the next wave. Let's see what that does. I've got 2 enemies that despawned. Okay. So as well as destroying them, we now need to use the game object function to find game object with a tag. And I'm going to find the tag called spawn. And from there we can get a component. And the component we're trying to get is the spawn component. And the function we're trying to access, let's just remove that because it didn't work, is called remove enemy. So this is what you'd have in your enemy destruction script. Okay, all I need to do for my purposes here is now set the spawn to have a tag of spawn. layers. Ogres have layers. Once we have defeated our first 2 monsters, bang bang, I can now spawn in, and then yep, there we go, that's working. So as you can see here, we've got an interesting series of behaviors. I'm just going to test this again nice and quickly to demonstrate that it won't spawn in until you've defeated all of those zombies, despite the fact that the time should be above the spawn time. It'll wait for them to despawn and then immediately spawn in the next wave, which is what we can see. Obviously, if you only wanted a single spawn point, no need for all of the many spawn point shenanigans. So I'll just leave that on the screen for those who would really like to see it. For those of you copying it off your phone, good luck with that. Okay, hopefully that was useful for you all. If there's anything that you need, give me a shout, and good luck for your expos, everybody.